Dear audience, dear colleagues, it is a virtual pleasure for me to welcome you to this session. My name is Niels Blokker. I'm Professor of International Organizations Law at Leiden University, the Netherlands. I will moderate this meeting from my home office in Leiden. Of course, we all regret that we cannot be in Washington now for this annual meeting. We miss the ambiance, the camaraderie, being together as Oscar Schechter's Invisible College of International Lawyers. But we are grateful that the American Society has managed to organize this meeting in an online format, just like many international organizations have tried to continue their work in the best possible way under the trying circumstances in which we live today. In this session, we will discuss how international organizations have performed during the current pandemic. To what extent have they been able to continue their work? To what extent did they suffer from immigration and quarantine restrictions, travel limitations, and the lack of in-person meetings? In the last few years, for example, during the general debate in the UN General Assembly, there have been heated speeches and debates about the pros and cons of globalization and multilateral cooperation. On top of this, COVID-19 came last year. Did this bring international cooperation and the functioning of international organizations to a standstill? Have states fully quarantined themselves, just like many people are now in full or semi-quarantine? Or does COVID-19 also teach us, again, the lesson that it is in our common interest to cooperate? As the new Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi recently stated, there is no sovereignty in solitude. But is it really possible to continue multilateral diplomacy and the work of international organizations mostly online without physical meetings? The Bulgarian Foreign Minister Ekaterina Zakarieva recently stated, with respect to the EU's Foreign Affairs Council of Ministers, and I quote, "We discuss sensitive issues. There are secure lines, but you never know who is listening. The discussion is always much more lively when meeting in person. Otherwise, most of us stick to our talking points. When we meet in person, we are much more honest and there are better results." End of quote. So is it really possible at all to do this work online? In this panel, we will discuss the experiences during the last year of a number of international organizations. And I'm grateful and pleased that we have 4 experienced and distinguished panelists to discuss these issues. They will each speak for 10 minutes, after which they will react to each other. Let me now introduce them to you, and I will do so briefly in view of the limited time that we have, in the order in which they will speak. First of all, we have Steve Matthias, Assistant Secretary General for Legal Affairs, the Office of Legal Affairs at the United Nations Secretariat. Secondly, Perry Lynn Johnson. She is Legal Advisor and Director of the Office of Legal Affairs in the International Atomic Energy Agency. She's based in Vienna. Our third speaker is Verity Robson. She is International Law Counselor working in the UK mission to the United Nations in Geneva. And our fourth speaker is Ambassador Namira, Legal Counsel, Office of the Legal Counsel, the African Union. So let me now immediately give the floor, first of all, to Steve Matthias. Steve, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Niels, and good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers for including me in this panel. I'm going to speak about the United Nations experience, in particular the experience at UN headquarters in New York, and I'm going to focus on the Security Council and the General Assembly, and I'm going to proceed largely in a chronological way. So we start in mid-March of last year. The lockdown in New York came relatively suddenly. Neither the Security Council nor the General Assembly had decided on the modalities of work if they could not meet in person. There was immediate objection by some members of both the Security Council and the General Assembly to having formal meetings on a virtual platform. It was argued that the rules of procedure were premised on in-person meetings and that the agreement of all members of a body would be required to have formal meetings virtually. It became clear that not all members would agree. This situation continues until today. There were complicating practical problems with proceeding to a virtual platform. Initially, it was not possible to ensure simultaneous interpretation into the 6 official languages of the United Nations on a virtual platform. It was also the case that not all member states had access to the commercially available platforms. So when the lockdown came, when in-person meetings at headquarters were not being permitted, the Security Council, which under Article 28, paragraph 1 of the Charter is meant to be organized so as to function continuously, it immediately moved to the holding of open and closed informal meetings by video teleconference. As these were not formal meetings, no decisions could be taken during these meetings. But the working methods of the Council, as agreed by its members, included arrangements for voting by correspondence. And so the decisions were taken in that way outside the virtual platforms through correspondence. In the General Assembly, the emphasis was on agreeing on a method of work that would allow the Assembly to deal with the urgent matters before it, which include budgetary matters and time-sensitive decisions. Among the time-sensitive decisions were postponing or changing the dates of meetings that the dates for which had previously been set by the Assembly, since only the Assembly could change those dates. The agreed method for decision-making in the General Assembly outside a formal meeting, which was not possible, was through placing a draft resolution or decision under a silence procedure for at least 72 hours. And if the silence was not broken, then that resolution or decision would be considered adopted. But this meant that a resolution or decision could only be adopted by the General Assembly if none of the 193 member states objected, so effectively giving a veto to each member state. Notwithstanding this fact, the Assembly was in fact able to deal with urgent budget issues and time-sensitive decisions during this period. Elections by secret ballot presented a unique problem, which was solved by one person from each delegation coming to UN headquarters on a staggered basis over the course of a day to submit their ballots. A number of meetings or conferences were postponed. At this early date, last March, it was thought that it might be possible for those meetings to take place later in the year. That did not prove to be the case. Among the meetings or conferences postponed were the annual session of the International Law Commission, the UN Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, the Intergovernmental Conference on Marine Biological Diversity Beyond Areas of National Jurisdiction, the UN Ocean Conference, and the NPT Review Conference. Now, there have been subsequent developments. In July, the Security Council began to have limited in-person meetings. These were held in the ECOSOC chamber rather than in the Security Council chamber to allow for social distancing between the members with a limit of 2 members per delegation. The Council now uses a mixture of in-person meetings, virtual teleconferences, which are not formal meetings, and voting by correspondence. In the General Assembly, beginning on September 3rd, they also began occasional in-person meetings under special conditions. Now, usually, as many of you know, the 4th week in September is the high-level week at the United Nations, when heads of state and government, as well as foreign ministers and others, come to New York to attend these meetings. That was not possible last September. It was agreed to use a hybrid format. So heads of state and government and foreign ministers would address the Assembly through pre-recorded messages, but those videos would be introduced by a representative in the General Assembly Hall. In November of last year, the General Assembly adopted by a recorded vote of 123 to 19, with 19 abstentions, a procedure for decision-making in the General Assembly when an in-person meeting is not possible, which contains a procedure for voting by electronic means without an in-person meeting. This has not yet been used, but it would be available in the event of another lockdown. I think it is noteworthy that 48 states did not support this resolution. In terms of recent practice, some subsidiary organs of the General Assembly have been able to hold formal hybrid meetings this month, with some member states participating online. This seems to stem from a recognition that there is a need for experts to participate from capitals depending on the subject matter under discussion. Some working groups of the Assembly have been able to hold fully virtual meetings, so long as no formal decisions have to be adopted. But of course, virtual or hybrid meetings involving experts from capitals require experts in different time zones around the world to adjust to New York time. The holding of in-person meetings at UN headquarters remains subject to various protocols and requirements. For example, only one representative per member state may attend an in-person meeting of the General Assembly. There are only 2 rooms at the headquarters that can host meetings of universal membership due to the social distancing requirements. This limits the number of meetings that can be held. As a result, informal consultations are being held virtually, and side events cannot be held at UN headquarters. In thinking about when it may be possible for conferences to again be held at UN headquarters, in connection with the arrangements for holding one of the conferences, it was considered that for full participation of member states, at least 5 elements would need to be present. Namely, that all travel restrictions in the United States are lifted, that visas can be processed, that flights to and from New York are operating, that hotels and food services are operating, and that UN headquarters is open with no restrictions in terms of the number of people and social distancing. We are not yet at that stage. So to sum up, some member states have continued their principled objection to formal virtual meetings throughout this period, and there seems to be no change in their position. The Security Council and the General Assembly have so far respected this position and have not proceeded to conduct formal virtual meetings. The Security Council and the General Assembly were nonetheless able to accomplish their essential functions during the lockdown. Mandates of peacekeeping missions were extended, budgets were approved, elections were held. It seems that the Security Council has been able to exercise more flexibility than the General Assembly in ensuring the continuity of its work, in the sense that it has continued to hold meetings by using a virtual platform, even though those meetings have been considered as informal meetings. Virtual meetings of the General Assembly have not been as frequent. Many important meetings or conferences have been postponed, mainly for public health reasons. However, this also seems to reflect a feeling among member states that the work of the conference could not be achieved through a virtual framework, either because decisions could not be taken in that framework, or because the work itself or the negotiations surrounding the work could not be advanced in an effective manner on a virtual platform. In this connection, it may be that some member states are of the view that the virtual or hybrid arrangements that currently exist are not adequate substitute for in-person negotiations. And in a sense, that is not surprising. In an in-person negotiation, one has not only the plenary meeting of member states, which can be duplicated on a screen, but the possibility of pull-asides and corridor conversations and walks in the garden. And these cannot be duplicated so far in our virtual world. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve, for this very clear overview. It's really a mixed picture that you sketch of what has happened at the UN. Thank you very much for that. I immediately now go to our next speaker, and she is Verity Robson, legal advisor of the International Atomic Energy Agency from Vienna. Welcome, Perry. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Niels. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you on this panel and with all of you in the audience to share our experience at the IAEA in terms of how we've managed during the pandemic. So I will be making a few brief points on one, our relations with the host country, Austria. Two, like Steve, touching a little bit on our policymaking organs. We have 2, the Board of Governors and the General Conference. And I'll say just a couple points on other meetings under the auspices of the agency outside of our formal policymaking organs. And a final point, of course, I'd like to make on our nuclear verification work, which is the work that we're most known for here. So on the host state, first of all, the principal legal instrument that governs our relations with the host state is our 1959 headquarters agreement. And it's based and very similar to the United Nations Headquarters Agreement. And Section 8 of that treaty refers to, inter alia, the reasonable application by the agency of sanitary regulations of the appropriate host country host authorities. Further to this provision in our headquarters agreement, we have been guided during the pandemic by two main reference points. One is the advice and recommendations of the UN system medical directors, and also the recommendations and guidance of, obviously, Austria as our host country in terms of mask wearing, hand washing, distancing, encouraging remote work, and so on. So these aspects are fundamental to how we've managed all aspects of our work during the pandemic. And in fact, I can say it's really been, well, let's say a success story in terms of our relationship with the host country. We've kept close consultations on an ongoing basis. And when they have implemented a new guidance, it allowed us to quickly internally in the agency update guidance for our staff. So it's been a constant update of internal guidance as well, in line with host country guidance. I turn now to the meetings of our policymaking organs. And as I mentioned, I'm going to talk briefly about both the Board of Governors, which is our executive organ of 35 member states that meets 5 times a year and whenever else is necessary, as well as our General Conference, which is exactly modeled on the General Assembly framework. It's the plenary body where 172, all of our member states, meet annually. So first on the board, just quickly, since May of last year, our board has been meeting in a virtual format for formal meetings of the Board of Governors in a virtual format. We were asked in the legal office to assess the rules of procedure, and we were supporting the chair of the Board of Governors in this regard. And essentially, we came out, provided the board agreed, meetings could indeed be held in a virtual format. And in order to accommodate this, a number of, let's say, arrangements needed to be agreed. And these were agreed by silence procedure, similar to what Steve was describing. So like the UN, we had the issue of how to proceed in all official languages. And initially, we could only proceed in English. And the board had to agree that the meetings could proceed in English only. Subsequently, we acquired an IT platform that allowed us to proceed in all official languages of the agency. We also had to modify the normal sessions of the board. Normally, the board has longer sessions, but to accommodate that we were working in a virtual context, sessions were reduced to 2 3-hour sessions or 3 2-hour sessions in order to accommodate this new setting. In addition, the board meetings are to be held in private in the rules of procedure. And so it meant that the board needed to be comfortable that the virtual setting provided sufficient security that the meetings would still be considered private meetings. And of course, our IT colleagues were involved in explaining the security features to the member states and so on, and the consultations leading up to the decision to proceed in this way. Everything proceeded in a virtual context except for one point, and that is the board did not agree that voting could take place virtually. So it meant that if any item under discussion was not agreed by consensus, the board would then resume in a physical context in the building with sufficient measures, of course, in line with host country requirements in terms of mask wearing, distancing, and so on, which also required limited size of delegations to meet these requirements in terms of distancing and so on, and numbers that could be in the room based on the size of the room. And what I have just set out is exactly how the board meetings have been proceeding since May of last year and are continuing in this way. And during this period, only once has the board had to resume in a physical context in the building. Otherwise, everything has proceeded virtually. General Conference. General Conference proceeded in a hybrid format. So those delegations who were here could participate in a physical way. And we also had an IT connection that allowed delegations to also connect in this manner. Similar to the board, we had consultations that led to an agreement through silence procedure on modified arrangements to accommodate this, the unique circumstances for this past General Conference, which took place in September. So again, there were limitations on the numbers who could participate, and this required, of course, that the rules of procedure on the size of delegations were suspended, because normally member states can have who they want in their delegations. It's flexible, and there are large delegations that traditionally come to the General Conference. But given the measures, the COVID measures, we had to reduce the numbers. And so there were 2 delegates per member state, only 1 delegate from international organizations, NGOs, and observers. And we also allowed pre-recorded video statements. And actually, I would say that this would be seen as a positive feature from the virtual setup. So because we had pre-recorded statements, we had more than 60 ministers attending the general debate of the conference. Normally, when we're having a physical conference, we wouldn't typically have that many ministers. So we saw that as a positive of this hybrid setup for the General Conference. Statements were requested to be shortened so that, again, we could take into account the time that we would need to have breaks in between sessions and so on due to the measures. And as Steve mentioned, the social aspects of the General Conference were curtailed. So all side events were virtual, receptions and social events were canceled, and there were no exhibitions. So the kinds of discussions and interactions that take place and the business that takes place in those contexts obviously was not possible. I wanted to just mention that although I've described this is how we've worked for our formal meetings of our policymaking organs, there were other meetings that have been postponed because the parties felt like it was not possible to have a virtual meeting. And the case in point are these treaty body meetings that we service here in the agency, where they have a review mechanism. They have peer review mechanisms, like, for example, the Convention on Nuclear Safety. In this context, for these types of meetings, contracting parties felt that they needed face time and that it wouldn't be appropriate to proceed in a virtual context for these meetings. And so Convention on Nuclear Safety, Joint Convention on Radioactive Waste Management, and the review conference for the physical protection, the amendment to the physical protection of nuclear material treaty has been postponed. These meetings have been postponed to 2022 and even into 2023 because of the parties' expressed view that they needed face time. Now, I want to give a final point on nuclear verification, just very, very quickly, because we're most known for this work. And I think you all know what it's about. We're seeking to ensure that nuclear material remains in peaceful activities around the world and that it's not diverted for nuclear weapons or other prescribed purposes. And the Director General, at the beginning of the pandemic, made clear that the agency doesn't stop for a single minute. And by that, he meant safeguards inspections had to continue. So how did it continue? How could we continue the inspections under the circumstances of COVID? Well, for the first time in the agency's history, we have had to charter aircraft to get inspectors into and out of certain countries. Not all, because in some cases, we were able to take flights, but as all of you have seen, in many cases, the skies were closed. So aircraft charter services for inspectors, first in the history of the agency, took place. We were working with states so that they would allow us in and also, allow us in without stringent quarantine requirements and so on. But unfortunately, what it's meant in practice is that inspectors have been tested multiple times just for a trip to go in and out of a country, even with our best efforts to try to reduce some of the requirements in terms of testing and so on, even quarantining. We've had inspectors quarantining sometimes in a country for 2 weeks, even before they could carry out an inspection. Notwithstanding, as the DG said, we were able to continue the inspections, and we were able to conduct additional verification activities both in field and at headquarters. We were able to make use of installed safeguards equipment at facilities in many countries, which transmitted data back to headquarters. We were able to prioritize critical missions. And all of these efforts have allowed us, despite the challenges of 2020, the Director General has informed the board in March that we will still be able to draw soundly based safeguards conclusions for all states. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Perry, for this helpful overview. Very interesting. Also, the final part about the inspections, very interesting to learn about this. Let me now immediately give the floor to our next speaker. And the first two speakers have given a perspective from international organizations, basically being legal advisors from international organizations. Our next speaker is Verity Robson. She's International Law Counselor at the UK mission to the UN in Geneva. And she's obviously working for a member state, United Kingdom. So we will hear from her whether the member state perspective is different in some ways, or whether the organizations in Geneva have had different experience from the UN and the Atomic Energy Agency. You have the floor, Verity.
Thank you so much, Niels, and also to ASIL for the kind invitation to be part of this panel alongside such distinguished speakers. I'm really delighted to be part of the discussion, and what I'm going to do is provide a view from the factory floor in the multilateral meetings and negotiations that happen here in Geneva. Before I go any further, I must of course clarify that while I am employed by and represent the UK government in my day job, working hours are over here and I'm speaking entirely in my personal capacity. I'm going to describe 3 effects of lockdown on multilateral diplomacy in the nearly 40 international organizations that are based in Geneva that I personally have observed over the last year, and the potential impact of those changes with respect to the development of international law. And to guide you over the next 10 minutes, I'll characterize those 3 effects as politics, participation, and personal relationships. Firstly, the impact of politics on international law has been made much more visible by the fact that not all of the organizations based here were able to move their business onto virtual platforms. As we've heard from Steve and Perry, secretariats have made enormous efforts to secure the technology that is necessary for meetings and voting to happen in a virtual way. In principle, therefore, it should have been possible for member states to agree to a pragmatic interpretation of rules of procedure in order that meetings could happen online. In the International Organization for Migration, for example, the constitutional requirement for meetings to take place in Geneva was accommodated by member states in the respect that the Bureau and the Secretariat sat in a conference room in Geneva, but member state delegates could dial in from their homes and offices wherever in the world those happen to be. In other organizations, though, states have blocked that kind of flexibility, citing a variety of concerns about technology or translation or time zones. In both the International Telecommunications Union and the World Intellectual Property Organization, for example, it was agreed that informal consultations could continue throughout the lockdown period, but that the majority of substantive items should be postponed until the resumption of physical meetings. And similar to Perry's experience in Vienna, members of states parties to the weapons treaties that are based here in Geneva have actually ground to a halt because of an insistence by some states that expert meetings must happen physically. What's been quite interesting to observe, though, from a cross-cutting perspective, is that in each of those organizations, the move to virtual meetings has been blocked by a different state or grouping of states. And one might draw the conclusion that the pandemic has been co-opted by delegations which already wished to disrupt or to delay the business of the organization in question. My second point on participation is a slightly more positive one. We've experienced both hybrid and fully virtual meetings here. And while hybrid meetings created a sort of 2-tier participation, fully virtual meetings have actually, I think, been more inclusive than physical ones. Last summer, the relatively generous Swiss regulations on gatherings meant that the majority of meetings took place on a hybrid basis. One delegate per state would gather in a very large conference room, and the rest of the delegates would join virtually rather than clustering around that single desk. Civil society was generally asked to dial in virtually too, partly to minimize numbers in the room and also to minimize the risk that people might undertake international travel in order to attend the meetings. An example of that would be the session in October of the Open-Ended Intergovernmental Working Group for Transnational Corporations and Other Business Enterprises, which was established by the Human Rights Council to elaborate a new legally binding instrument on business and human rights. Now, normally, civil society organizations at those sessions are a vocal and forceful presence in the room. They are a human reminder of the potential consequences of irresponsible business behavior. And their absence from the negotiation room this autumn made the discussion feel far more technical and legalistic. In contrast, fully virtual meetings have proven to be, I believe, a model of inclusivity that we should seek to retain even once physical meetings are again possible. For civil society, virtual meetings have enabled a greater variety of organizations and representatives to attend than in physical times. Geneva is a really expensive city, and the majority of organizations that have a base here or are able to fly into Geneva for meetings have a lot of financial backing behind them. But virtual meetings have proven to be more democratic. The UN Minorities Forum was held entirely virtually for the first time at the end of last year, and that enabled a much bigger variety and geographical spread of organizations to dial in, including those with very little in the way of financial backing. At the state level, too, virtual meetings have facilitated greater parity between different regions. There are 177 states with permanent missions here in Geneva, but a couple of those missions only have 1 or 2 staff. And those also happen to be the missions who cannot afford to fly in extra colleagues from far-flung capitals to bolster their attendance at clashing meetings. Luckily, though, fully virtual meetings enable people to attend from capital with the same speaking conditions as those who are joining from Geneva. That was the case during a state expert meeting on IHL, which was held wholly virtually at the end of last year. And it was certainly enriched by the participation of military experts from capitals who would not have been able to fly in to attend the physical meeting that had originally been scheduled. My third and final point is that where multilateral negotiations have continued virtually, they have been made much more difficult by the impossibility of physically mixing with other delegates. And over a more prolonged period of time, that could well lead to delay or fragmentation in the development of international law. An outcome document, whether that's a treaty or a resolution or a decision, is always the product of compromise. And the extent to which any state's views are reflected in that compromise is going to be dependent not only on that state's political weight, but also on the influence of their negotiator. And that negotiator's effectiveness is dependent on their personal relationships. It's why building a solid network as a diplomat is so important. Even if your respective countries are politically miles apart, you can usually find common ground with another professional who has chosen to work in international affairs and lives either in the next neighborhood to you or maybe in the same apartment block. These relationships lay a foundation of trust and cooperation on which compromise and consensus can later be built. But in lockdown, as everyone knows all too well, communal and spontaneous contact has been much reduced. There are no longer any corridors in which we can bump into those from our wider circle of acquaintances and exchange a laugh, build some rapport, and maybe exchange some intel too. The absence of those physical meetings, I think, creates 3 risks from a legal perspective. Firstly, ambition can be lower. So some pen holders in the June and September sessions of the UN Human Rights Council last year proposed fairly minimal updates to quite important thematic texts, fearing that attempting anything too sensitive or complex might well fail in circumstances when delegates were still getting to grips with online platforms and no longer had the chance to thrash out differences over a snack from a vending machine late at night. Secondly, national positions can become more firmly entrenched. Delegates risk retreating into their established groupings, whether those are regional or just on WhatsApp, and forfeiting the cross-regional pollination of ideas that made UN coffee shops such useful places to hang out. I had the impression during the 46th session of the Human Rights Council that just finished yesterday and was the first session to be held fully virtually, that finding compromise was just much, much harder than usual. And that was evidenced, I think, by the number of negotiations that really went right down to the wire and the vote count on some of the resolutions that were voted yesterday. Lastly, some legally significant negotiations have been delayed indefinitely. In 2019, a new ad hoc process was established to try to develop a new political declaration on the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And in early 2020, it looked like we would be able to reach agreement on the text within a matter of months, subject to resolution of a couple of contentious questions. Obviously, that process was put on ice throughout the lockdown period. And although it was recently warmed up at the start of this month with some virtual meetings, the only thing that we can agree on all at the moment is that there will be no agreement on the final text until face-to-face meetings are again possible. In conclusion, then, I would say that the move to virtual meetings has been generally positive, but virtual negotiations have become much tougher. I think it's too soon to have enough data to evaluate the impact on the development of international law, but it could make for a pretty interesting research project in a couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Verity, for your interesting observations. From Geneva, it's really a mixed conclusion that you draw, I feel. Some disadvantages, but also some advantages. Very interestingly, you said that virtual meetings seem to be more democratic because of the high cost of Geneva. So it was very interesting to learn from your comparative perspective also, seeing how different international organizations work. Now, as a final speaker, we have Ambassador Namira, the legal counsel of the African Union. And we are very grateful that she is with us. And let's listen to her and see whether the African Union perspective is different from the experience so far of the universal international organizations. Namira, you have the floor, please. You're still on mic, on the mute, Namira.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Neil, and good afternoon or evening to those joining us from around the globe. And I would like to express my appreciation for the American Society of International Law for inviting me to be with you today. Adaptation is the one thing that COVID-19 pandemic taught us, not only as human beings in our personal lives, but also as professionals working in multilateral diplomacy. We learned the hard way to adapt to this new reality of continuous lockdowns, working from home, conducting meetings virtually, and possible negotiations of legal instruments online. Simply, with all the challenges we met, and despite the slow mode, multilateralism is still functioning and business is continuing. And that is our experience in the African Union. I would like to start by pondering upon our work in multilateral forums in relation to the pandemic itself. So multilateralism, starting with WHO, was at the helm to call on solidarity of the international community to respond to COVID-19 pandemic. I can't help but be reminded of the absence of such solidarity in managing the current global crisis and managing the vaccine distribution issues to fight COVID-19. WHO considered the vaccine nationalism constituting a massacre to the current system, which would have been sufficient to handle the pandemic and the equitable distribution of vaccines. Wouldn't that lead to a major doubts regarding how far can we depend on multilateral diplomacy to deal with such a crisis? I can dare to say that we at the African Union may be able to counter these doubts. When the lockdown started around the globe in March 2020, the AU didn't waste much time. We moved our work to the online fora, and the Bureau of the Assembly on the level of heads of states met to work out a solution for the continent. There was no session in place, and the future of holding an extraordinary session was not yet perceived at this early stage. Yet there was a need to form a fast and efficient response despite all the financial, legal, and procedural challenges. The Bureau wanted to establish a COVID-19 response fund for Africa, but the means remained problematic. Hence, my office, the Office of the Legal Counsel in the African Union, came up with the innovative solution. It is there in the UN, but it doesn't exist in the African Union in relation to the circulation. So our innovative solution was first to classify the situation as force majeure. And as we are in force majeure, it permits the Assembly to overlook part of the procedures necessary to adopt its decisions, including the lack of a sitting session. The second was to draft the decision to establish an African Union COVID response fund and circulate it to member states for commenting. Third was to adopt the decision by circulation under the silent procedure process. Guess what? It worked. We managed to establish the fund legally, and within less than a month, the board was formed and had its first meeting to assess the situation in the continent. Based on the advice of Africa CDC, the board studied the way forward. This constituted a precedence in our work. As I'm saying, we don't have this adoption on silent procedures. This was because we are in force majeure. And that is, as I'm saying, it's really constituting a precedence since the inception of the organization in the 60s. But as we say, different times permit different measures. When the fund was up and running, it constituted a show of solidarity where the wealthier countries in the continent and those who had the ability contributed generously to the fund. With money and in-kind contributions, the AU managed to support full procurement of diagnostics and other medical commodities that were distributed to the member states by Africa CDC. This was imperative to ensure the success of our efforts to curb the spread of COVID-19 in the continent and to prove that multilateralism works. This was a success story, but a slowdown phase existed in other aspects since the close down of the AU premises on 13th of March 2020. This combined with relative resistance by member states to hold their meetings virtually, it's new, not much trustworthy, lack of steady internet connections, and lack of human contacts were some factors behind the suspicion that this tool may work. I think we heard the same from representatives speaking about the UN. Meetings kept being postponed and travels were canceled until the threat of running out of time to prepare the budget for the new fiscal year loomed. Notwithstanding the decision to postpone the meeting of the Executive Council, for those who are not familiar with the structure of the African Union, the Executive Council is the forum for our foreign ministers, which is basically mandated to adopt the budget of the Union. There was a legal deadline for the adoption of the budget before the end of October that had to be met. With this in mind, and in the prolongation of the pandemic situation, member states decided to hold the meetings to negotiate the budget online. This was a really daunting exercise. Yet, the security situation when we started in Addis wasn't at its best, and the government blocked internet access. This led to a one-day physical meeting in the biggest hall at the headquarters. The following day, this pleasant event was met with a catastrophic measures and briefing from both our medical services and Africa CDC that they advised basically that physical meetings should stop at this stage because of sanitation issues. Even in the biggest hall, with hosting one member per delegation, it was still a big threat. Of course, this led to an uproar among our member states and a call on the host government to restore the internet connections to the diplomatic missions in Addis, and this worked. As of this time, not only the budget was negotiated online, but other important decisions were adopted virtually. We have negotiated in the subcommittees and in the permanent representative committees the new staff regulations and rules and the new financial rules and regulations. They are yet to finish the process internally with other forums in the context of member states. But this was also something that took very long meetings, and member states were able to continue negotiating. Meetings on all levels took place virtually, including the assembly on the level of heads of states and government, where the rules of procedures of physical meetings were applied on the virtual sessions. This also constituted a precedent. This virtual tool, although it facilitated our work, it wasn't free of challenges and hurdles. Disruption of internet connections caused several interruptions in statements, time zone differences, and lack of certain tools to conduct some business, like elections, led to the postponement of electing new members of several organs. Moreover, this situation had legal implications when the mandates of committees faced delays beyond the prescribed timelines, and the implementation of decisions that require presence on the ground, like projects on the grassroots levels, were not carried out. Yet, as of the success of the online Executive Council meetings, the Mid-Year Coordination Summit was held in October 2020, using the virtual mode became business as usual. Here, there are two issues I would like to address with legal importance. First, the Assembly has turned a blind eye to its bureau, acting ultra vires on its behalf, to adopt decisions in relation to moving meetings to the online setting and changing summit dates without the approval of the entire House per the rules of procedure. And second, the elections of the senior leadership of the AU Commission. As I mentioned earlier, until October 2020, we didn't have tools to conduct elections virtually. And there was resistance to that idea by member states. On top of the reasons, of course, the lack of confidence in an online tool that will be secure enough to ensure a proper balloting that is secret and not tampered with. Circumstances surrounding this issue had major legal and political circumstances and considerations, especially that we had the deadline to hold the elections of the senior leadership of the Commission, a new Commission for the African Union. That was a real major challenge. Because of all this, on the Assembly level, there was persistence to keep February 2021 physical until close to mid-Jan, where basically they came up and said, no, we will end up having it virtual. From this side, from my side as legal counsel, I needed to find a tool to manage and conduct the elections online. What we did is to develop internally, learning from the African Development Bank experience, to have a system of elections online where it was approved by the member states and the elections were held successfully on both levels, the Assembly and the Executive Council, to elect the African Union chairperson, deputy, commissioners, and members of other organs. I know I'm running out of time, so I'll just conclude by saying the good thing about this pandemic, I will look at the positive aspect, that it's the first time we had the 55 member states joining in the elections and voting. Member states realized the importance of internet in our part of the world, and they are willing to invest in the infrastructure of the of developing the internet in order to make sure business will continue. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Namira, for your views and explaining how the experience has been in the African Union. Very interesting, the generic force majeure solution that you have been able to find. And also, we realize again that it is not obvious that we have internet all the time, particularly these times. If internet is blocked, as you had the experience one day in Addis, that seriously complicates the work, of course. We have a bit less than 10 minutes left for this session, and there is a very strict clock ticking just in front of me, but it just offers enough time for each of the speakers to react to what they have heard from each other. And I think that's very interesting. So let me immediately go to Steve. Steve, is there anything that you have heard from our other panelists to which you would like to react? Any positive or negative experiences in other organizations?
Well, thank you, Niels. And I thought all the other panel presentations were extremely interesting, but with your permission, I'm actually going to raise a legal issue of a different character than I dealt with in my initial presentation, but I think is an interesting one. So when conferences are held away from UN headquarters, we, the Secretariat, would normally negotiate a host country agreement with the state that's hosting the meeting. And that host country agreement would normally, among other things, it would provide immunity from legal process with respect to participants in the meeting, for what they may say in the meeting or what they may do in the meeting. Now, that it would include not only representatives of states, but also Secretariat and also the other, civil society representatives that may be participating in a meeting and NGOs and so forth. So when participation is virtual and those individuals are participating from other than the host country of the virtual meeting, their participation would not have the benefit of those privileges and immunities. In principle, we're not negotiating with every state in which a person who is participating in a meeting may be presently located. And so as a technical matter, the basis on the legal framework within which a person is participating in a meeting may be different if they're not in the state where the meeting is being held. So I just wanted to note that as a technical point. So far, we haven't had any problem in practice that's resulted from that. We haven't had a problem where a remote state has sought in some way to take legal action with respect to participation by somebody. But I thought it was a point worth noting. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Steve. And of course, we have a wonderful panel full of specialists here who may have some suggestions for you. And this is, of course, the opportunity for the other panelists to help Steve out, but also to react to what you've heard. Let me now quickly go to Perry, whether you have any comments or questions to the other panelists.
Thank you, Niels. Actually, it is a good point, Steve, that you raised. And we also have not had any issues about privileges and immunities relating to the delegates who've been attending these meetings remotely, virtually. So it hasn't arisen. But I'm curious from the panelists, because I did note, Niels, and you said it a couple times, that the experience has been mixed. Steve talked about, wasn't perfect in New York in terms of the ability to have these meetings. Verity was saying the same. It was interesting to hear from the member state perspective. So does it mean, I'm just wondering, does it mean that we don't see the pandemic making setting longstanding precedents in terms of how organizations are going to interact going forward? Outside of the international sector, Bill Gates, private sector, they're saying things will never be the same again. And we're going to be doing things virtually and remotely. So Verity, in particular, in light of the number of comments you made, it sounds like maybe that this won't happen in the international context. So I'm curious to see the reactions on that. our experience was I think more positive than the others because we actually had formal meetings virtually. They were not informal meetings. It's just that for voting we had to come to the building, and no one mentioned costs, saving travel costs. We've saved millions and millions of travel costs, and our member states in developing countries and so on who might not have been able to come or been able to participate. Verity, you made this point. We're at the table, although virtually. So, just wondering if there's any reaction on that issue of the precedent and the future.
Very interesting, Perry, and it's nice that you mentioned travel costs because you also mentioned in your speech that your organization had to arrange airplanes to arrange inspectors. So that seems to cost a lot of money, but it's interesting to see later on after the pandemic is over whether life will be different a little bit. And then, I mean, not to mention only the positive things, I think you all have mentioned that multilateral negotiations are much more difficult now. It's not possible to have sit-asides, to go to the Vienna Cafe in the UN Secretariat, to have the regular wining and dining, which is so essential if it really gets difficult for international negotiations. And I mean, where is international law if you can simply decide to postpone an entire year of International Law Commission meetings? So there are also questions here, I think. Let me quickly go. We have less than 4 minutes to Verity now for some final questions and observations.
Thanks, Niels. I'll react briefly to the points that Perry has just raised. I think actually over this period, we've seen an acceleration of some changes that may well have been overdue. We now have much better IT, member states and organizations. We've also managed to reduce international travel tremendously, which has to be better for the environment. And I know it's something that's been on all our minds for a number of years. And actually, the pandemic has forced us to do something about it. And as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, I really think for governance meetings and exchanges of views, the inclusivity has really improved through virtual participation. But there, of course, there will be things that we cannot maintain. And I long for the day when I get to eyeball my opposite numbers over an actual table when we're negotiating, because online it's not the same experience, and I don't think we're getting the same outcome. So we'll keep some of the good stuff, but hopefully get some of the normal back soon too.
Thank you, Verity. Namira.
Thank you very much, Neil. I would just say, like, basically, if we look through a positive lens, we can see that this pandemic is a blessing in disguise, because we have discovered many tools that save the environment on one side from our travels. At the same time, it helped us to develop the internet in order to have better connectivity. As Verity said, yes, it's very difficult, and the lack of human contacts in multilateralism affects so much the negotiations. It makes it very difficult to reach agreement, and sometimes, at least my experience, when we have very long meetings, member states, they end up being exhausted and they approve anything, and then later they come and complain about what they have actually agreed on. So this is where we are, and I think we will end up reviewing many of these things when we get back to the physical meetings. It is difficult times. We're trying to adapt, but it is, at least we managed to find a tool. I'm not sure it's sustainable, because we still need to meet personally when the pandemic is over. And maybe just to comment, one of the questions was in relation to what organizations are doing for their staff. From our side, we issue circulars to all the staff to make sure to minimize the number of people physically present in the commission. The numbers are rising as we speak in Addis, and those who are infected in the commission. So we keep updating these in order to make sure sanitation is taken on board and to save lives. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Namira. Well, only a few seconds left. Let me use this final opportunity to thank all the participants in this panel warmly from my Leiden home office for your interventions. Very interesting, very useful. The jury is still out, I guess, whether the glass is half full or half empty. But we feel now very much informed about the actual experiences during this pandemic in different international organizations. And at least we have seen a number of concrete examples where the experience has been positive and also negative, of course. So I warmly thank you. Discussions may now continue in a separate room. Continue the conversation, this famous format by the American Society, but for this moment, this panel is over. I thank the American Society and I warmly thank again the panelists. I hope to see you on some future physical occasion. Bye-bye.